Good morning. This is Axel Merk, President and Chief Investment Officer of Merk Investments, with my Tuesday morning update. Risk is on, at least in the currency markets. Let me go through here the equity and fixed income markets first briefly. S&P futures are up now 7.5. We're up a little bit more overnight and briefly dipped negative. The Dow is up 150, but the S&P, the Nasdaq is also up right now. It's up 10, 11 points. European markets were up quite strongly. Euro Stoxx is currently up at 2.25%. The DAX, which was closed yesterday, is up 3.4%. Notably, the automotive sector has done very well. Let me just put on, since I mentioned automotive, let me put in my disclosure here just briefly so that I have shown that to you. The government in Germany is discussing stimulus package, and so that's part of the reason that several companies are big there. Nikkei was up 1.1%, Hang Seng 1.1%, the Chinese market, the CSI 300 there, up 0.3%. And the fixed income market, the 10-year is right now it's flat, just down a fraction of a tick, and the 30-year is down 11 ticks. The 3-month T-bill is at 13 basis points. 3-month LIBOR is, if I can find it, is at sorry guys, is at 34 basis points. The effective Fed funds rate at 5 basis points. And one of the things that's quite notable is that the 2-year rate is we are at 15.6 basis points, and that compares to the 3-month T-bill at 13 basis points. So the 2 years out, just about the same rate as it is here. So very flat in the beginning, and then it gets a little bit steeper. On the fixed income side, currency, as I mentioned, the dollar is broadly weaker, with the commodity currencies leading. The Australian dollar, again, the leader, up 1.1%, followed by the Kiwi, up 90 basis points. The weakest currency is the yen, down 65 basis points. The only currency down in the G10. Swiss franc is flat. And then gold is up 20 basis points. Spot gold is now up $3.5 at 1743. Yes, and if I look on the screen, the euro continues to zoom ahead. It's just in the middle of the pack now. It's just the euro is obviously one of the more prominent currencies that dominates the dollar index. And so we've really seen a breaking down in the dollar index of late. Obviously, no assurance that will continue to happen, and it's not investment advice. But the dollar was a big beneficiary in the risk-off environment, in this crunch and search for liquidity. And so it seems like there is a gradual normalization. Talking about normalization, certain things are not normal, but let's talk about the normalization things. The reported death rates and infection rates in the US continue to gradually come down. I'm aware of news reports that in some cities there are some spikes, but at this stage they're just daily spikes. Obviously, some people are suspecting that with these protests that the spreading will increase. Now, but let's also keep in mind that in cities where there are riots, other people are staying at home. It's not like everybody's on the street, and so we'll have to see how that plays out. Importantly, Google has been publishing its mobility data, and they suggest that driving is back to normal. Now, yesterday I was jogging, and one of the roads that usually always has a traffic congestion had a traffic congestion, whereas it hadn't had one in weeks. So I guess from that point of view, yes, but there are other areas where the traffic is, to my view, clearly still lighter than it had been. But in any case, some things are gradually coming back to normal. In other parts of the world, they've been several steps ahead in the opening phase, and when I talk to friends in Europe, they suggest that in a variety of places things are pretty much back to normal. There's still restrictions in place, obviously, and restaurants there's more spacing and whatnot. But things are gradually opening up. In the meantime, governments continue to have stimulus programs in place, and that has helped to support the markets, it seems. Um, Good. Then I'm just checking the VIX index is here at 2793. The VIX curve is positively sloped, so we are in an environment where the future is less certain than the present, and that's the more normal scenario. Obviously, we had years of the VIX index being substantially below 20, and so from that point of view, that's still elevated. Um, and then, of course, we've had numerous news. On the geopolitical side, before we talk domestic, Merkel has said that he doesn't know yet whether she can attend the G7 in late June. For context, Trump has invited folks to come over, but expanded the invitation. And in some ways, of course, he has a point because the G7 is a bit of an outdated model. But one of the countries he has invited is Russia. And Russia, as you may recall, invaded Crimea, and so they are being banned from many international venues. And so with that, of course, Trump is rocking the boat, and so Merkel may, out of protest, not show up, and suggesting that it's the pandemic is presumably a good excuse. But of course, several other things have happened domestically that are very, very sad to watch. The question, in my vantage point, is always, at least in the context of me talking here, is whether there is a market impact, and so that's of course much more difficult to tell. But a lot of my viewers are kind of on both sides of the aisles. Uh, I have a problem with the kind of the lack of principle and consistency of organization and so forth. I'm a strong believer in the separation of the rights of the states versus the federal government, and that applies to many levels. And it seems like any administration, notably also this one, wants to have their cake and eat it. They want federal control when it suits them, and they want to decentralize when it suits them. And so they want to take the right from California away to regulate the emissions, move that to federal level, even though they're according to the kind of that dogma that shouldn't be the case. And so similarly now the president is threatening to deploy troops within the states. And James Madison, um, uh, one of the original interpreters of the Constitution, so to speak, and wrote several Federalist papers as well. He very strongly believed in a strong state militia to defend against foreign invasion. And when he referred to foreign invasion, at least on an incident, he was referring to the federal government. And so he thought the federal government needs to have a weak army. Now, obviously, um, we've had centuries since move on and other established practice and so forth. But in any country, it is a really bad idea to have the military deployed domestically for a whole host of reasons. And so, presumably, the intention here is to rattle the cage, and which is what Trump is doing best, and get the governors to do something. But it's very very disturbing to watch what's happening on all levels. Um, but does it affect the markets, right? I mean, that's I guess the question in the context of me talking here is, and it affects it, I suppose, in the sense that what are the re-election odds and what are the policies going forward? And it does appear that what's been happening of late has hurt the president in the polls just a little bit, but but he is, of course, the reason why he is talking the way he's talking is to appeal to his base. There are lots of people in his base that very much cheer on the sort of tough talk that there is, rather than the consolidating talk. And Trump is not going to get the votes in California and New York, and so he may not care. And so that's so well. November is a long way off, and in the meantime, we see things play out that are the way they are. I mean, ultimately, they hurt the businesses that have been most hurt by the COVID-19 outbreak to begin with. Retail stores, because they get looted, it doesn't help them. And that, on the one hand, is of course the big brand name stores that are the main target, but there's been plenty of looting in mom and pop shops, and those have had tremendous suffering and damage to begin with. So it's extremely um, heartbreaking to watch that stuff. The the question then is, well, what will happen, kind of what's the market and whatnot. And the market has, of course, seems to have been moving on, thanks to plenty of cheap money that's been around. There's still plenty of opportunity for second waves. Is there going to be a second wave of the virus because of the protests? Well, it's certainly possible that there's going to be localized outbreaks. In Palo Alto, there are protesters, but they diligently wear masks. They're proper Palo Altans, I suppose. In the places where the protests are less civil, not so much necessarily. And Nikki Haley, I think, she phrased it well, and it's well worthwhile following her on Twitter if you don't do that, where she says that it's the role of the local authorities to protect the protesters' rights to protest, while at the same time making it clear that law and order has to be enforced, and that looting and rioting is not permissible. And so I'll leave it at that. And there's in my view a sensible voice in all of that. Um, so anything about the markets? Well, it is noteworthy. We've had this very tight range in the currency space. The euro was hovering around 108 for an extended period, and we've moved to 111.81 right now in the euro, and so that's much higher. We do have several central bank meetings this week, including in the eurozone, and Australia just met as well, and Bank of Canada is meeting as well, and so there's several things. Now they've all quote unquote printed a lot. Question is whether there's much to be seen. The eurozone continues to have this thing hanging over them of the German High Court, which the ECB may well ignore, but the Bundesbank may not. And then, just for context, the Bundesbank said that some of the things that's been happening is unconstitutional, or at least against the law, because the German parliament has made it very clear we don't want to bail out other countries. And so if the ECB does it, that's no good. So unless the German parliament authorizes that, the Bundesbank shall not participate in these programs any longer. At least they're given a few months before that would take into effect. And so there's some sort of constitutional battle brewing. And I kind of invoked James Madison earlier, and it's the same sort of thing. It's the EU in some way is a young construct, and certain things haven't been ironed out. And some people say it was very inappropriate for the German High Court to intervene here. I would strongly disagree. It was exactly the role they have to play. Now, does that mean that should be the status quo? Well, that's a political decision, and the politicians need to make up their mind. But it is not for central banks to set new rules and set new policies, and that's really one of the big problems I have with the U.S. Federal Reserve and central banks and other places. They are just putting things in place that they are not, in my view, authorized to do. They obviously, there's emergency authorization, but the point being is that they should not be engaged in fiscal policy. And so the worst of the crisis is over, and yet the Federal Reserve is gang-ho on rolling out programs that are clearly not monetary policy, the Main Street lending program, the municipal lending program, and so forth, that are really a credit allocation that's supposed to be made by elected officials. And now that said, of course, if you talk about municipalities for a moment, they are suffering quite extensively. Tax revenue is down substantially. Expenses are up substantially in some areas. And so that's, of course, taking these places to a breaking point. There needs to be a political debate, though, how that is managed. And there's no easy answer to that. But it cannot be that a central bank with a bazooka printing press is bailing out everybody. And of course, and then I just talking about inflation here briefly. I got an email yesterday or the day before that inflation cannot happen if it's only getting into financial assets and not into things that drive GDP. yes, there was an if there in that sentence, right? I mean, how long is that going to be, and at what stage is it going to trickle over? And what's the whole point here of inflating financial assets? Is there really a good justification for doing that? And so there are plenty of concerns, and of course, in that context, of course, um, there is absolutely no assurance that the S&P is going to continue to ride its way higher. The so-called V-shaped recovery, we've had the global PMI kind of pop back up a little bit, but if you only go to the 50 level, then that's an L shape. That means it's going to be even from there on, and we're not at 50 at many of these things. We also get, by the way, the unemployment report the Atlanta later this week, and we'll see whether we break the 20% barrier in unemployment. In the meantime, of course, people are getting quite a bit of a paycheck if they are unemployed and are part of the system for a little while anyway. And that's been making it difficult for some recipients of the PPP program and in restaurants to hire workers because they have to give unemployment to work then at near minimum wage at times in restaurants. And so there's all kinds of things, and it's the faster we get out of this, the better. And we get out of this by figuring out ways to open up the economy. On that note, by the way, um, our office building has and to continue to work at home. Everybody in our company is. Our office building has new rules in place, and one needs to certify all kinds of things. Um, if one wants to get into the building at nighttime, currently there's no cleaning. Not that that's really too necessary, but because of the curfew that San Francisco has as well, for example. But lots and lots of rules. In the meantime, a company was in the news yesterday about moving their part of the workforce at least to cheaper places because you don't need to have everybody in San Francisco where cost of living is very high. And so the question is the Bay Area going to suffer? My own take on that is that the Silicon Valley was bursting at the seams, and having a bit of a slowdown doesn't is not the end of the world. Obviously, it's not good for tax revenue, but if there's a region that benefits from the move to online, virtual, and all that, Silicon Valley is a main beneficiary. There has been a trend in recent years to have non-essential functions already be much more outsourced, and in our business we see that we have much less staff than we used to have because we outsource everything that we can and just have the core analytical skills we have in-house, and most other functions we do outsource. Anyway, let me leave it at that, and be safe out there, and take care until next time. If I can push the stop button on my broadcast, it does seem to be stuck here. That's interesting. All right. You know, I am. All right. So my monitor is frozen and I can't turn it off. That's an interesting one. Okay. Well, I can tell you a few other stories if you want me to, but at this stage, I will cut this broadcast off in a different way, and let's see what's going to happen. Okay.